It's easy to overlook documentation when building an application, but documentation can make or break a consumer's experience. Today, we're diving into the world of documentation to discuss what it takes to write good documentation, the ethics of documentation, and some popular tools you can use to get started.
Welcome to the Ladybug Podcast. I'm Kelly.
I'm Sidney.
I'm Ali.
And I'm Emma, and we're debugging the tech industry. How often have you struggled to learn programming because you just couldn't find the right resource to suit your learning style? I struggled for nearly a year before stumbling upon a website known as Front End Masters. I've been a long-time paid user of the online learning platform simply because I find the courses to be comprehensive and beginner-friendly. They have the best teachers in the tech industry, and they're one of the reasons I was able to land my dream job. With Front End Masters, you can learn web development, responsive design, backend development, animations, testing, algorithms, data structures, and more. You can pick a course you're interested in or follow one of the learning paths like React, Vue, Angular, data visualization with D3, Node.js, and more. To learn more, head to frontendmasters.com.
Why is uncoupled code documentation bad, and what does that even mean? At Swim.io, they believe developers deserve code documentation that they can trust. Swim's continuous documentation tool helps teams create code-coupled docs that are auto-synced with their code every time the code changes across multiple repositories. Swim helps teams ramp up new developers easily, enable a culture of knowledge sharing, and ship code faster. Swim's continuous documentation pulls from the CI/CD. It is easy to deploy and keeps teams afloat and happy. Swim Beta is now available on swim.io. Join Swim on their community channel and learn more about their continuous documentation manifesto on swim.io.
Cool. So let's kick things off by talking about why a company or application even needs documentation in the first place. Have y'all worked with documentation, or have you created documentation, or have you just consumed it?
More consuming it than I've created it. And I'm a person that really likes pictures and examples. And so maybe I do a little bit too much of that, but that has always been helpful for me. So I am only hoping that it was helpful for somebody else.
I write docs as part of my job. I don't own the documentation for our tool, but we are open source. And so I consult on it from the most part from like an education standpoint. I have also worked on that at other jobs that I've been at, but also I find it's really important. I'm a manager of a team, and so writing down as many processes as possible so that instead of repeating the same thing over and over again, I can send docs to people and make it so that processes are really codified instead of just wong every time that I'm in a new conversation about something.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So there are like a few different reasons why, and I feel like documentation is not like a one shoe fits all. It's kind of like multi-purpose, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But like essentially we can have documentation for internal tooling. We can have documentation for external consumers of open source software. Like Ali works on an open source piece of software. We can have documentation about team dynamics and like team workflow. So your company or app really needs good documentation for kind of all of these reasons, right? So consumers know how to use your software if it's open source. Like for Spotify, we have open source documentation about how to embed our players on your applications. And it used to be that like nobody really wanted to read documentation, but I think that paradigm is changing, and it seems like people really do enjoy well-written docs so long as they're helpful. So I'm curious to see what the community thinks about this episode. I think it'll be interesting. I think like a big question is, who do we write documentation for? Because I think with a lot of coding, we attribute that to like, oh, we're writing for computers, which I guess theoretically is true. But at the same time, we write software for humans, and we also write documentation for humans.
Right. Like you have to think about it as like, remember, the computer is not the smart one. You are. And you're going to have to somehow like translate that so the computer is able to do like whatever you're wanting it to do, whatever software that you're wanting it to do. So it's those like step-by-step instructions to have to like go through and like get processed for the person, for them to write the software, for them to write the program, so the computer or whatever it is can be successful. Yeah.
Yeah. I also think it's important to state that the docs are for people, not computers, but it's also important to think that those docs are for a specific subset of people usually, and you need to think about who the consumer of those documentation are. Like, what context do they have coming into it? So I have documentation for my team that's internal, but I also have documentation for other teams that's how do you work with my team? How's the right way to get in touch with us? How can you add items for us to do? Things like that, because there are going to be different audiences that need different information. Even our external open source documentation, we have getting started guides for people who are just, dipping their toes in the water versus API documentation for people who are really looking under the hood, or guides for people who are doing advanced use cases. And I think it's important to think about all of those different personas and make sure that you're writing with them in mind rather than just a generic person that you're not thinking through, if that makes sense.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think we had a conversation the other day at Spotify about, do we have like an all-encompassing documentation that lists out what features should be on which pages of our application? So like if you go to a show page, for example, what are all the things that I should be seeing on this page? Because we need to maintain feature parity across like the native desktop app, the mobile web player, the web player. And so like, do we actually have a list of that anywhere? I'm sure we do, but it's also like you need to surface this documentation and make it accessible to people in an easy to find location. And I think there's a quote from Ashley Bischoff that says, "No one's ever complained that something was too easy to read." And I think that's so true. It's like when in doubt, make the language as clear, concise, simplistic as you can. We'll talk in a second about what makes good documentation. But, Ali, like you brought up, like, oh, you should know who you're writing it for. And I absolutely think that's true. But at the same time, we need to maybe keep in mind that not everyone has the same baseline level knowledge. So, like, how do we balance that?
Yeah. But I think on top of that, knowing what fits in your documentation versus what fits elsewhere. Like, for example, we have a JavaScript open source library. But explaining to somebody what a for loop is within that is probably not the right fit, because there's 8 bajillion resources out there on how to write a for loop. And you can kind of safely assume if somebody's at the level of JavaScript that they're looking for libraries, they probably know what a for loop or a function is. But if your desired user is completely non-technical, you're going to have to give them super in-depth explanations of everything technical. So yeah, I totally think you're right that people like things that are as easy to understand as possible, but make sure that you're giving them the information that's most relevant to them.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing is it might not hurt to add like here's what's expected. Like you should have this baseline knowledge before you read these docs. I think that's actually really helpful because I see a lot of like online courses do that. Like if I'm teaching like a CSS frameworks class, I would, it would be helpful for you to have foundations of CSS, or, same with React. It would be useful to have a foundation of JavaScript. It could be useful to do that with your documentation as well.
So like just having a list of prerequisites and maybe some resources recommended before you start kind of going into that documentation. Yeah. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it could be usful.
No, I agree. Yeah. Like you should be at an intermediate level of React before you're using this thing. I think that that's very fair.
I will say that like sometimes people don't have the privilege of being able to learn those things prior to using them. Like if they're in a job, maybe they don't have the time to go out and do it. But by linking to related resources within your documentation, like if you mentioned hooks, for example, linking to the hooks documentation, that's going to save your consumers a lot of headache trying to make sure they have the right resource. And I guess this kind of leads us into like this conversation of what makes documentation good, because I do think linking to relevant resources is definitely a good one.
Yeah, I think personally one of the most important things is making it so that it's very easy to navigate and there's a consistent information architecture where the there's either a search functionality or there's a hierarchy of information. The way that the navigation is structured allows you to actually find what you're needing. And I think there's a lot of ways to measure whether people are finding what they're needing. Maybe having some sort of thumbs up or thumbs down at the bottom that's like, was this helpful? Or a comment box like, did you find what you actually needed on this page? I think all of those types of things can make it so that your docs are continuously growing and continuously being updated to be most relevant to whoever's consuming your docs.
Absolutely. One other thing I notice in docs sometimes is that they include proprietary language or acronyms. I've had this issue at like all previous companies I've worked at where sometimes we have an internal name for something and we let that leak into our documentation. And it's like our consumers and customers have no idea what that means and it's not relevant to them. So just ensuring that you're stripping out all of that proprietary language.
And on top of that, making sure that you have inclusive language as well, like making sure that you're able to reference clear and concisely, like what exactly is going on with this particular step, as well as not saying that anything is easy or simply do this, or gauging a scale of like how difficult that a specific task might be, because that's up to the person actually consuming the documentation to actually decide for themselves. And then whether or not they do want to continue on with the documentation or go to one of the resources that you recommend is going to be up to them and going from there.
Yeah, and we'll talk in the next section about the ethics of documentation. This is one piece of it that Sydney had just mentioned, and it's totally a valid one because it literally costs you nothing other than a few minutes to make your documentation inclusive, and there's really no reason you shouldn't be doing it. And I think another thing that I've noticed to make things inclusive for non-native English speakers is to make your passages clear and concise. So trying to strip out all the redundancy or the run-on sentences. There's an app called Hemingway that you can use to ensure that your writing is really clear and it helps remove bloat. So yeah, ensuring, I think we forget sometimes that we have a lot of developers from other countries who are non-native English speakers, but are forced to speak English when it comes to learning or in the workplace. And so removing, any additional bloat from documentation helps them.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. Sometimes I need to be a little bit better on when it comes to my writing. As much fun as being an English degree person is, I definitely am very much so a person that will put in redundant language. Like even me speaking is the thing where I'm like, I'm saying things way too much. It's way too many run-on sentences. I need to be very clear and concise. So I will definitely start using Hemingway. That's not a bad resource at all.
Yeah. And of course, if you're listening, we'll link all this stuff in the show notes. But I think one other thing that's important to note is addressing common errors. I don't know the last time I saw like really great documentation that included this, but the thing is people are going to run into issues with when they use your software. It is inevitable. So it's better that you address those from the very beginning and say, hey, this could possibly be happening to you. If it does happen, this is why, and here's how you need to fix it. I don't know. Have y'all come across that at all when you're looking at documentation?
I was actually gonna ask you, like, how would you like categorize that like in documentation? Because no, I don't particularly see that all of the time, where it's more like I have to go like Google if something happens, of course, like using our Googling skills to actually like solve the problem. And I'd say 9 times out of 10 I'm able to figure it out and solve the problem and then kind of go back to the documentation. But how do you think it would be beneficial for people to actually put that into documentation, like step by step, like through the actual steps that you're putting into the documentation, and say like, okay, if you get this problem, like kind of a fork in the road, if you're getting this problem, then you do this. If you get this problem, you do that, and then kind of go back to whatever the steps are. How do you guys think?
I think in context is a great way to do it if applicable, but there's no harm either in having like a troubleshooting section of your guide that's like, here are the most common problems that we've seen from pull request or issues in our repository. Because often, like, yeah, to your point, I'll just go Google the error and have to search through like Stack Overflow or open or closed issues on the repo, and it can just be like overwhelming.
Yeah,
So
I think this brings up a couple of good points for writing documentation. So the first one is that if you see an issue keep coming up, that's a really good sign that it's not clear enough in your documentation that that thing is the way that it is. So make sure to include that and have it so that it's searchable as well. So like I think SEO is actually a really big part of creating good documentation. You want your stuff to be findable. If somebody Googles something, they should be able to find the answer for that thing in your documentation. And so make sure to be optimizing for that when you're writing your docs. The other thing is that error messages are a huge part of developer experience. And so if you can make it so that your error message is the actual thing that's like, okay, you can read in the documentation about common issues with this here, or if you can almost solve their error within the error message, that's really great developer experience and will make them more likely to use your thing. And so I think that falls into documentation, but it can also fall into the library and the code itself. So it's kind of a mix.
Absolutely. And I think just a couple more points to what makes documentation really great is obviously it has to be accurate, up to date, make sure that you're updating it as things change, and that you're consistent. I think, this makes a big difference between like decent documentation and like really great documentation is like consistency on like, it could just be the visuals of it. Honestly, like it's not just about information architecture, it's also about like, how you present that information architecture, ensuring that like on all your different pages, like your navigation is consistent, making it really easy for your users to find information, even maybe just how you reference things. Like if you're going to be using an acronym, like make sure that you define it and be consistent with that. Don't like flip flop between different terms for the same things maybe.
Yeah. And I think on the creator of documentation side, there are ways that you can ensure these things. So one is a joint ownership model of the documentation. And this is what I've seen at actually a lot of companies. And that is that the engineer working on the feature writes the first iteration of the documentation and updates the documentation to match the new feature that they're creating or any type of changes that they're making to the library. So if they're changing something that changes the documentation, they should be also writing the initial form of the documentation. But then there should also be a documentation owner who then goes through and combs through that and makes sure that the tone is consistent for the documentation, that it has the appropriate amount of detail, that it has the good practices that you've set out for your docs in the first place. And this is what I've seen a lot of really successful documentation teams doing, that somebody is writing this feature. And so when they write this feature, the documentation is part of the feature. They should own that when they're doing that, but then also making sure that somebody has the high level overview of making sure that everything still is consistent and good quality.
Absolutely. And then I guess there's a concept of long form and short form. Which one of you wants to explain that?
So I think that there should be a combination of formats in your documentation. So long form guides that show you how to put the different things together, and potentially even like end-to-end tutorials that you have in your docs. And the reason that differentiates from a third-party blog post is that it's updated. Most of your third-party blog posts are not going to be updated, but everything in your docs should be updated. And so people can go to those long form tutorials of sorts in your documentation and know that they're up to date. And then also there should be short form documentation so that if somebody Googles something, they can find the answer really quickly without navigating through a whole entire blog post. They have that answer right then and there. And those are usually API documentation or shorter form pieces of documentation that you'd have as well. And so I think having a combination of those things is really important so that different users at different points in their journey can find their answers quickly and efficiently.
It's very clear to me that Allie's a teacher.
Right? You know what I wish kind of was in the realm of like proper documentation, I'm being reminded of how like I will look up a recipe for something and I have to go through all of like the memories that people share about this particular recipe. They're like long stories about it. And these like are the different things that you have to do to get like this recipe just right and all that fun stuff. And then finally at the end of the page, that's when they actually give the recipe. And that is super freaking annoying. So that it makes more sense about the difference between long form and short form now that you've explained it. So thank you, Allie.
It's so funny because I tweeted that once and I was like, I don't care about your grandma's, best friend, Charlotte, and how she got the recipe. And I remember, I think it was Rachel Neighbors commenting and being like, I actually enjoy that. And I'm like, oh, maybe I should start enjoying it. And now, the closer I get to 30, the more I'm like, I like reading about your grandma's best friend, Charlotte, during the cookie recipe. But to your point, when it comes to documentation, it's really not the place.
Yeah, it should be pretty to the point.
Yeah.
Also, and not have a huge amount of framing. Not each article should be standalone not standalone. All of the different pieces of documentation should be woven together so that people can find exactly what they're looking for. You're not restating what the thing is a bajillion times. You're not explaining how to create a hello world in it at the top of every single page of documentation. You don't want any of that, but you do want to link to those things so that people can get started if they need to. And that's where having this information architecture that people can easily navigate is really important so that they can find what they need if the article that they land on is not what they need.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
One other thing that Spotify did really well during orientation was they have this thing called the golden path that everyone who joins as an engineer or I think a data scientist goes through this. And essentially it's a series of tutorials where you choose your primary domain, whether that's web, backend, data viz, any of those areas. And they have a guided step-by-step tutorial on how to build a full stack Spotify application from, building it using our design system to deploying it internally. And this internal documentation is so invaluable. If you have the ability to create these types of documentation tutorials for your new hires and you work on an enterprise level application, 10 out of 10 recommend doing this.
That sounds lovely. That sounds so amazing.
Well, let's talk about, the talk that actually inspired me wanting to discuss this topic in the first place. When I was speaking at GraphQL Day in Bodensee a couple years ago in Germany, Carolyn Stransky gave a talk about humanizing your documentation. And we're going to link it in the show notes. The talk is really, really great. And let's go through a couple of these points now. As Sidney had mentioned earlier about using inclusive language, but what does that actually mean? I think the first is about gender. I think this is kind of a big issue within programming communities about using gendered language. So here's an example. If the programmer wishes to uphold the invariant, he must satisfy the function's preconditions. Using he as a pronoun. It's not necessary when you're writing documentation. And is it going to prevent someone from being able to successfully use your software? No. But is it going to be a better consumer experience if you're inclusive to everyone? Yes, absolutely. And it costs you literally nothing to change that pronoun. So that, in terms of gendered language, just take a quick look through your documentation and ensure maybe you're using they, or that you're switching up pronouns, for representative of the entire community and not just sticking with one.
And you don't even, I think that the use of pronouns, they is a great way to start, but even just as the developer must satisfy the function's preconditions. We don't even have to include the pronoun of a person in the first place. Just having the title of what the expectation is of the person should be doing that is using the documentation could be useful as well.
I think it makes it less professional too when you're talking. And was it?
Yeah.
I don't even know. Third person. I don't even know. When first person and third person can kind of make your writing seem a little bit more informal. And documentation most of the time is considered a professional environment. So yeah, to Sydney's point, maybe let's just not use pronouns at all and keep it very much. What would you even call that?
I don't know.
I don't know what it's called. It's when you don't use pronouns at all.
Yeah, I don't know.
Is it called passive voice? I don't know. I'm not an English major, but.
No, it wouldn't be passive voice, but just trying to avoid situations where you would use pronouns in the first place.
There was a lot of discussion around problematic or racist language in the programming community a little while back, only a few months ago, specifically when they were talking about master branch on GitHub, and there was, a big push to change it to main branch. So ensuring that your documentation is inclusive and non-racist in language is a very like, it's a quick way to make everyone feel included. So as opposed to using master and slave, use primary and replicate instead. Or as opposed to using whitelist and blacklist, use an allow list and deny list instead. And like, I saw this conversation around whitelist and blacklist specifically that was saying like, well, it's not inherently racist. But the argument is like, it might not be inherently racist, but what it's doing is associating whitelist with good and blacklist with bad, or white with good, black with bad. And like, if you can make your documentation inclusive, there's no excuse not to. So use allow list and deny list. How do y'all feel about that?
My eyes are rolling in the back of my head right now. Like, it's really interesting how people like still use the term slave as like another like branch from the master. And honestly, I didn't know that that was a thing until a couple of years ago. So it was just like, oh, well, that I kind of understood the connotation, but after like just like reading some other articles about it, and it was just like, oh, okay, well, I guess that we're not going to be using that language anymore, at least not in my presence. So that's it. I don't understand the need, and I'm not really sure like where that originates from, but it's kind of hilarious and just very eye rolly that was the thought.
I think the other thing too is that you can set up linters to check these things. So sometimes people mess up, especially if they've been using these terms for years and years. And so having some sort of script that checks your docs before they go live, that the right terminology is being used, that your documentation is as inclusive as possible, that words like easy or simpler or whatever raise a bell, or make sure that it's allow list instead of whitelist. Like all of these things, you can set up code to make sure that they're being followed. And so that could be a good way to make it so that this is really no lift.
And I think like, if you're listening to this and you're freaking annoyed at the fact that we're now like questioning your words of choice, like, is this, it's just language, who cares? It's like, if you're offended by that, you should maybe do a little bit of introspection there and say like, hey, if I can use different words and it makes other people feel more included, it's not that big of a barrier. So like, just get over it. Sorry, but like, I have no I have no patience for people who get offended because, words are offensive. It's like, you don't get to decide what's offensive to someone else. If it's offensive, like, just get over yourself and use a different word.
Right.
That's all.
Absolutely.
Sidney, you had mentioned the terms simply, easily, or obviously, or a little bit earlier.
To your point, like, if you're offended because you can't say simply, easily, obviously in your vocabulary when it comes to your documentation, it says a lot more about your character and what you have kind of dissociated yourself with when it comes to honestly being stuck on a problem in the different kind of like stages of your career. I might be using your documentation, Emma, and like, no, I don't want to be told that this is simple because I'm coming to your documentation for a reason. Clearly it wasn't simple, You had noted that Jim Fisher had opened the 2018 edition of Write the Docs in Prague, and their conference had stated that he did a quick search for the word simply on GitHub and found it over 92 million times. These are 92 million references when it comes to the word simply on GitHub. And that's really crazy. That's really mind-blowing that people are still kind of not in that mode of that like learning and curiosity and being empathetic to people that are really just trying to find the answers that they seek without having to feel like they are inferior somehow because they have to look, because they have to do the Googling, do the research that they need to on GitHub. And just on any level, you've needed to research and do something with documentation before. So I will fully admit that I get super offended and frustrated with myself and with other people when you give me a solution and it's, you simply do this and this is really easy. I wouldn't have come to you in the first place if this was fucking easy.
Yeah.
Just
I
point blank
actually
period.
I catch myself a lot. It's something I've had to strip out of my vocabulary because it's just second nature. It's just very colloquial language, I think. And, it's a conscious choice that we have to make to strip that out.
Yeah, and I think even going beyond that from a documentation perspective, your documentation should be very fact-based and to the point. It shouldn't be like a narrative. It shouldn't be your marketing. And so you just don't need easily or simply because you're not trying to sell this to somebody. You're just trying to show them how to use it. And so it's just fluff, I would say, into your documentation. So it's not good from an inclusion perspective, but also it's just not needed from a good quality documentation perspective.
Well, if all of this sounds like a lot to remember, Carolyn actually created a language linter called Alex, and it's meant to catch insensitive or inconsiderate language. So we'll link that in the show notes. And there's also a website called Self-Defined. I think it was created by Tatiana Mack, and it's a modern dictionary for language. So its goal is to provide more inclusive, holistic, and fluid definitions to reflect the diverse perspectives of the modern world. So if there are any terms that are, problematic or harmful, you can generally go there and see why. And there are different labels for like ableist language or sexist language and things of that nature. So again, highly recommend checking those out.
Great. I'll definitely be using that.
Let's talk about code, because a lot of times we're writing documentation with code snippets, and I just want to list off a couple of things that are important to keep in mind. I see this often, as on Twitter a lot, where people post images of code snippets and not have an alt tag or not have a link to like an accessible snippet, which is annoying for, copy and pasting purposes, but it's also annoying for people who rely on screen readers to analyze images. So anytime you have text inside of an image, it's just bad practice for accessibility. But, at the very least, you should be including a link to an accessible snippet. So ensure that you're doing that. Your code snippets really should never be screenshots. You can use the code HTML tag for inline code and the pre tag for blocks of code. So that's just a really quick win in terms of accessibility there. But one other thing I didn't think about that Carolyn mentions in her talk is to use descriptive variable names. It's much easier to follow documentation and tutorials if your variable names have proper descriptive names. So don't use Fubar and Baz. Actually use, if you have like number of clicks on like a counter, call it num clicks or something that like indicates what that variable is holding.
Does anybody know where Fubar and Baz came from at all?
Yeah.
Because I avoid documentation like the plague when they have foo and bar in it, because it is so hard to read. Like, what does this signify to me, Do you
know what it is, Ali?
I don't know if it's necessarily podcast appropriate, but it was from the military, and like Fubar was fucked up beyond recognition. And so that's what Fubar is yeah. You two shocked faces right now. Yeah. Yeah.
What kind of dumb shorthand? What? That doesn't make any sense going into tech. Like all of these interesting like names and concepts that people have like decided to come up with. That is shocking. Yeah. That is so shocking. Okay. Thank you for that explanation. I appreciate it.
I'm horrified.
Oh my gosh.
Cool. Yeah. Okay, so never using that again. Great. Love that the military has spilled over into programming. Am I shocked? No.
It's from like 1965, to be fair. It's been before any of us were around, but yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I wasn't even a zygote, but I'm still offended. So, all right. To move off of that strange note, don't you love that when you're like, I wonder where this came from? And it's like not cool. It's weird. All right. So Ali had mentioned information architecture previously, but really quickly, like the structure of your documentation is important. And I think when you are documenting new features, for example, one great way to do that is explain what your feature is or what it does, and describe the use case. Like, why would you use this? So often, when I think of use cases, I think of design systems and style guides where they're describing maybe the difference between a link and a tertiary button, which looks very much like a link. So why would you use one over the other? And so if your app doesn't work for a particular use case, just be transparent about it. I massively respect people who can admit that, like, they haven't covered like a specific use case, or like, I guess my point is like, I just respect when people or companies are very transparent about like, hey, I recognize there's a downfall or a pitfall here, but like we're aware of it and like potentially working on it. So, and it also helps to recommend tooling if there are specific problems that need solving that you're your app or your technology doesn't cover, maybe recommend something that does work in tandem
I
with
think
it.
that's a good recommendation. In addition, like I said this before, but having the ways to bubble up feedback about your documentation so that when people get stuck, you hear about it. I think that that's so important. Just having it be as low lift as possible so that you get people's feedback and make it better for the next people.
So we can talk more about like what types of documentation that we should be writing. And I think, I guess one of the main things that we should be talking about with this is how to even use an app that you're making in the first place, like how you're actually using the feature and kind of going through step by step as to why that you've decided to make this, what problem it solves, making sure that you're able to spin it up, how you're able to integrate this particular app that you are studying documentation for into the app that maybe you're making, how they can work in tandem. What else? What else from that? I think we've talked about a little bit component documentation for internal usage. I would love to get a little bit more clarity on like what you're meaning by that, Emma.
Well, like if I'm building a component library, let's say a button, what are all the props that can be passed in to customize it? What information is required? What information is optional? Like obviously the required prop is going to be the child with the text for the button or an icon. Maybe there is no text. Maybe it's an icon, but in that case, you need an ARIA label. So like documenting the expected, required, optional props, things like that. But also like the customizations, like buttons can be big, small, extra large. They can have different colors. They can be primary, secondary, tertiary. Like we need to be aware of what all of those things are.
Right. Okay. So having a place where you're able to see like all of the default kind of like settings of what actually like is going on when it comes to like that particular app that you were researching documentation for.
Well, yeah, especially if this is like a library that's going to be incorporated to another app. Like if I'm building a component and I have the code for button, .jsx or .tsx or whatever language I'm using, obviously I can go open the file and see what props are required or optional. But often if we're using a library, that is all abstracted away and we don't have access to that very easily. So you need to make it easy for your consumers.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Did you have anything to add to that at all, Ali?
I think this is a pretty good overview of having guides on how to use the thing, why you should use the thing, how to integrate common technologies with your thing, and then having API documentation, which I think kind of covers the component documentation. That's actually, what are the different options for this? How do you drill down? What are the possible permutations that you could do of this thing? And then having internal documentation is so important too for your team, how to work with your team, what your team does for your team, on your processes. All these things are so important. Like I work for obviously a very large company. We have an internal Google or like how you search for internal documentation on things. So I can definitely speak to that and it being really helpful. And we have like wikis on everything. And it's so necessary when you scale into a bigger and bigger company. And when you work for a startup, usually there's no documentation on anything. And so you're just winging it. But I think writing things down is one of the most important ways that you can scale and allow people to replicate what you're doing, but also just to learn and to make things really systematized and scaled.
Because like that's super dangerous to have all that stuff in your head. First off, like what if you leave? Like you're just going to kind of like leave your new team members potentially like to the wind, just fending for themselves if you don't have any of that stuff like in your head down somewhere. Even if it's like written, somebody can type it up. Somebody can at least go and look it up to see if that's in records somewhere from your existence. And I'm sure that, to your point, you were saying that you have documentation for ways to actually get into contact with you, with your team, how to actually put different types of problems that you need to solve in a queue and what exactly you're working on right now. Cause I think that's super important as well for like people that are trying to figure out like who you need to go to actually get a problem solved. Like that isn't a bad idea to say like, okay, this is what we're currently working on right now. This is what's in our queue. If you like need to be nosy and know our business about that. And I don't know if we'll be able to specifically like do your request anytime soon, but you can leave it in there just in case, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think even those documents on how to request work, how to best communicate with you, you can even have like a personal README that you send to people. Here's the best way, like Slack me, don't email me, I'm bad at emailing, like things like that. I don't have Slack on my phone. I think that helps people to communicate with you in the best ways. And so it doesn't even have to be a company that has documentation. It can be a person that has documentation.
Slack is chaotic good. I hate the beep. I really do.
Oh, I've been getting ads for Slack, and it has the little ping noise, and it gives me anxiety every time. I'm like, no, absolutely not.
What the hell advertisements are you looking at? I
don't know. It was a lot of times when I had a Hulu subscription, and there was Slack ads all the time within Hulu.
Oh, that is awful. I'm so
be like,
sorry.
Ping.
Like, oh shit, I need to go check my computer. No, sir. That sounds awful. I'm so sorry.
Oh, gosh. Well, should we talk about where we can actually host docs? I think, Ali, you wrote some of this down.
Yeah, for sure. So I thought it would just be a good thing to quickly run down what tools you can use for creating documentation and where to host them. So you can host them on your site. So you could have your own domain and all that. You could also host them on GitHub. Having a README is so important to link out to the documentation, to talk about how to install your thing, to have a really short form of the documentation. I think all of that can really help people who just have like a few seconds to look at something. And if your thing is open source, then having the short form of that is so important. Storybook is another one that we have linked, and that one becomes really important if you have UI components or a component library.
Yeah, for sure. So, speaking of Storybook, you had mentioned like calculating all the different permutations of components if you're doing a component library. Storybook is wonderful. I used it when I was teaching my friend in master's course about building a design system with React. It comes with a lot of really great add-ons or for building component libraries. So you can add an add-on that not only documents the component, but actually renders them so the consumer can see them and interact with them. They have like a ton of different add-ons that you can use, and they're all super useful. I do know they went through like I say pretty recent update, but like realistically, it's probably a year ago now because the pandemic has skewed my timeline of everything. But if you are building component libraries, 10 out of 10 recommend Storybook. The team is great. The technology is great. It's the best that I've found for components. But there are a ton of different types of software for writing like more prosaic documentation. So I just did a quick search before, recording this for different tools that you can use. Bookstack seems to be one. It's a self-hosted platform for organizing and storing information. It's also free and open source. I haven't personally used it. I was watching a YouTube video briefly called Writing Technical Documentation, and that covers how to use it. So we'll link that in the show notes as well. And then a couple others that I found. Nuclino seems to be one that's pretty cool for team organization specifically. Docusaurus is one that I know at my last company, one of my friends, Khalil, was working with for our application GoToMeeting. It seems pretty simple, not simple. I hate that word. It seems pretty straightforward to set up. But lastly, I think is Sydney's favorite technology, Notion, because she has told us a lot about that. Notion is a really robust application, and I've seen it used for full-on like courses or for design systems and stuff like that. You can definitely use it, but I highly recommend understanding how it works before you just jump in, because it is a little confusing.
Yes, very much so. To Emma's point, I don't love Notion for that fact. I am a person that like, I need to get something done. And the reason why I'm like using documentation is for like these simple reasons. And as much as Notion is like really great and robust and it's used for different things, for me, it is like way too many things for like the one thing that I need to do. So I will stick with my markdown language. I will stick with GitHub and post all of my stuff there. Thank you very much. You said that another documentation tool are some static site generators. So for like Next and Nuxt, Gatsby, Jekyll, I'm sure that there are a couple of others that we aren't naming. Is there any like specific things that you'd like need to do to set those up at all, or like find them?
No, I mean, we have a episode on Next.js. I think we may have had one way back in the day about Gatsby too, an early episode, but really these are probably the most common tools that you see for corporate documentation, because your documentation doesn't need to be a dynamic site. So it's normally going to be a static site generator that generates the documentation. And so there are different tools that you can use for that. I think a static site is very appropriate for docs because you don't want it to be heavy. You want it to be fast loading. You want it to have good SEO. And so those are some of the common tools that you would use for it.
Are we ready for shout outs? I would really love to hear more about Emma's particular shout out. Yeah, why don't we start with you?
So I bought a house.
Woo! Yeah!
And I'm living in that house. So now I can fill it with 12 kids. Kala is very much against that idea because in Sweden, generally, if you have more than 2 children, it's strange. But yeah, I'm adamant we're going to have 12. So, I am prepared.
That's good to know.
It is a lot.
Wait, have we seen pictures of this? Have we seen pictures yet? Or did I miss them?
I think I posted a couple, but like we're still unpacking. Like all my clothes are still on the floor.
That's fair.
They are now cat beds.
I'm going to go stalk your Twitter then. How about that?
Awesome. Sydney, what's your shout out?
So I have recently been reading the book, The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks. I have been going through my own move and transition lately, and I'm freaking the fuck out. There's so much to do. There's so much to see, and I will be updating everybody about that soon, but now I'm kind of in that mode where I feel like I am making my fear kind of hold me back from my actual zone of genius. And so going through The Big Leap has given me a lot to think about when it comes to my processes of how I worry and where exactly that worry gets me when it comes to feeling like I am in a case of lack or in a space of lack, and going past that to actually get into my zone of genius where I am emitting that confidence and that happiness that the best case scenario will always come through if that's what you want. So big ups. I really like this book. So we'll see how it goes. And yeah, I'll be having some other moving updates for you guys, but that's it. Ali?
Cool. Mine is like a super random one, but I switched from using the Mint app for tracking my budget to the Copilot app. And I like the UX of the Copilot app a lot better. And it helps you categorize things and tells you about subscriptions and things like that. So I don't know. It's one that I've been enjoying using and wanted to shout it out to not do a book for once.
That's awesome. Cool. Well, speaking of books, I couldn't think of anything relevant to give away for this. So I'm going to be giving away a copy of Hello World by Hannah Fry. I just finished it, and it's one of the best technology books I've read to date. And it's all about being human in the age of algorithms. It's very fascinating. And she, in the book, talks about like art. So like movies and music and how, AI has impacted that. And she talks about cars and the justice system. And it is incredible. And anyone who works in tech absolutely needs to read it. So that's what I want to give away. And if you liked this episode, tweet about it. And we are going to pick one tweeter to win a copy of Hello World by Hannah Fry. We post new podcasts every Monday. So make sure that you are subscribed to be notified and leave us a review. I guess with that, I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks. See you guys soon. Bye.